The Anglo-Saxon occupation was no sudden conquest but extended over decades of fighting against the native Britons. The latter were finally largely confined to mountainous region of Wales, where the modern form of their language is spoken alongside English to this day. The Britons had become Christians in 4th century after the conversion of Emperor Con- Constantine, along with most of the rest of the Roman Empire, but for about 150 years after the beginning of the invasion, Christianity was maintained only in the remoter regions where the as yet pagan Anglo Saxons failed to penetrate. In the year 597, however, a Benedictine monk, afterward a St. Augustine of Canterbury, was sent by Pope Gregory as a missionary to King Ethelbert of Kent, the most southerly of the kingdoms into which England was then divided, and about the same time missionaries from Ireland began to preach Christianity in the north. Within 75 years, the Iceland was once more predominantly Christian. Before Christianity, there had been no books. The impact of Christianity on literacy is evident from the fact that the first extended written specimen of the Old English Anglo Saxon language is a code of laws promulgated by Ethelbert, the first English Christian king. In the centuries that followed the conversion, England produced many distinguished churchmen. One of the earliest of these was Bede, whose Latin ecclesi- ecclesiastical history of English people, which tells the story of conversion and of England English church, was completed in 731. This remains one of our most important source of knowledge about the period. In the next generation, Alcuin, who was born in 735 and was died in 804 century, a man of wide culture, became the friend and advisor of the Frankish Emperor Karl Magan, whom he assisted in making the Frankish court a great center of learning. Thus, by the year 800, English culture had developed so richly that it overflowed its insular boundaries. In the 9th century, the Christian Anglo-Saxons were themselves subjected to new Germanic invasion by Danes, who in their longboats repeatedly ravaged the coast, sacking Bede's monastery among others. Such a raid date in the 10th century inspired the Battle of Meldon, the last of the Old English heroic poems. The Danes also occupied the northern part of the Iceland, threatening to overrun the rest. They were stopped by Alfred, king of the West Saxons from 871 to 999, who for a time united all the kingdoms of southern England. This most active king was also an enthusiastic patron of literature. He himself translated various works from Latin, the most important of which was Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, a 6th century Roman work, were also translated in the 14th century by Chaucer. Alfred probably also instigated a translation of Bede's history and beginning of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. This year by year record in Old English of important events in England was maintained at one monastery until the middle of the 12th century, but practically all of Old English poetry is preserved in copies made in the West Saxon dialects after the reign of Alfred. The Anglo-Saxon invaders brought with them a tradition of oral poetry because nothing was written down before the conversion to Christianity. We have only circumstantial evidence of what the poetry must have been like. Aside from a few short inscriptions on small artifacts, the earliest records in the English language are in manuscripts produced at monasteries and other religious establishments beginning in the 7th century. Literacy was mainly restricted to servants of the church, and so it is natural that the bulk of Old English literature deals with the religious subjects and is mostly drawn from Latin sources. Under the expensive conditions of manuscript production, few texts were written down that did not pertain directly to the work of the church. Most of English poetry is contained in just four manuscripts. Germanic heroic poetry continued to be performed orally in alliterative verse and was at times used to describe current events. The Battle of Birth, which celebrates an English victory over the Danes in traditional alliterative verse, is preserved in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles. The Battle of Meldon commemorates a Viking victory in which the Christian English invoke the ancient code of honor that obliges a warrior to avenge his slain lord or to die beside him. These poems show that the aristocratic, heroic, and kinship values of Germanic society continue to inspire both clergy and laity in the Christian era, as represented in the relatively small body of Anglo Saxon heroic poetry that survives this world shares many characteristics with the heroic world described by Homer. Nations are reckoned as groups of people related by kinship rather than by geographical areas, and kinship is the basis of the heroic code. The tribe is ruled by a chieftain who is called king, a word that has kin for its root. The lord, a word derived from Old English half, low plus weird. Protector surrounds himself with a band of retainers, many of them his blood kindred, who are members of his household. He leads him men in battle and rewards them with the spoils. Royal generosity was one of the most important aspects of heroic behavior. In return, the retainers are obligated to fight for their lord to the death, and if he is slain, to avenge him or die in the attempt. Blood vengeance is regarded as a sacred duty, and in poetry, everlasting shame awaits those who fail to observe it. Even though the heroic world of poetry could be invoked to orally resistance to the Viking invasion, it was already remote from the Christian world of Anglo Saxon England. Nevertheless, Christian writers like the Beowulf poet were fascinated by distinct culture of their pagan ancestors and by the inherent conflict between the heroic code and a religion that teaches that we should forgive those who trespass against us, and that all they that take the sword shall punish with the sword. The Beowulf poet looks back on that ancient world with admiration for the courage of which it was capable, and at the same time with elegiac sympathy for its table dome. For Anglo-Saxon poetry, it is difficult and probably fertile to draw a line between heroic and Christian. For the best poetry crosses that boundary. Much of the Christian poetry is also cast in the heroic mode, although the Anglo-Saxons adopted themselves readily to the ideals of Christianity. They did not do so without adopting Christianity to their own heroic ideal. Thus, Moses and St. Andrews, Christ and God the Father as represented in the style of heroic verse. In the Dream of the Road, the cross speak of Christ as the young hero, strong and stout-hearted. In Xamundon's Haim, the creation of heaven and earth is seen as a mighty deed and establishment of wonders. Anglo-Saxon heroines too are portrayed in the heroic manner. St. Helena, who leads an expedition to the Holy Land to discover the true cross, is described as a battle queen. The biblical narrative related in the Anglo-Saxon poem Feudate is recast in the terms of Germanic heroic poetry. Christian and heroic ideals are poignantly blended in The Wanderer, which laments the separation from one's lord and kinsman and the transience of all earthly treasures. Love between man and woman, as described by the female speaker, the wife's lament, is disrupted by separation, exile, and the malice of kinfolk. The world of Old English poetry is often elegiac. Men are said to be cheerful in the mid-hall, but even there they think of war, of possible triumph, but more possible failure. Romantic love, one of the principal topics of later literature, appears hardly at all. Even so, at some of the bleakest moments, the poets powerfully recall the return of spring, the blade of the magic sword with which Beowulf has killed Grendel's mother in her sinister underwater lair begins to melt. As ice melt when the father eases the fetters of the frost and unravels the water ropes, he who wields power. The poetic diction, formulaic phrases and repetitions of parallel syntactic structure which are determined by the versification are difficult to reproduce in modern translation. A few features may be anticipated here and studied in the text of Casimundus hymns. Poetic language is created out of a special vocabulary that contains a multiplicity of terms for lord, warrior, spear, shield, and so on. Synecdoche and metonymy are common figures of speech as when keel is used for ship or iron for sword. A particularly striking effect is achieved by kenning a compound of two words in place of another, as when sea become wheel, road, or body is called lifehouse. The figurative use of language finds playful expression in poetic riddles, of which about 100 survive. Common and sometimes uncommon creatures, objects, one phenomena are described in an enigmatic passage of alliterative words, and the reader must guess their identity. Sometimes they are personified and ask, "What is my name?" Because our special vocabulary and compounds are among the chief poetic effects, the verse is constructed in such a way as to show off such terms by creating a series of them in opposition. In the second sentence of Casimandon's hymn, for example, God is referred to five times oppositively as He, holy creator, mankind's guardian, eternal Lord and Master Almighty. This use of parallel and oppositive expression known as variation gives the verse a highly structured and musical quality. The overall effect of the language is to formalize and elevate speech. Instead of being straightforward, it moves at a slow and stately pace with steady indirection. A favorite mode of his indirection is irony. A grim irony pervades heroic poetry even at the level of diction where fighting is called battle play. A favorite device known by the rhetorical term litotus is ironic understatement. After the monster Grendel has slaughtered the Danes in the great hall, horror it stands deserted. The poet observes it was easy then to meet with a man, shifting himself to a safer distance. More than figure of thought, irony is also a mode of perception in Old English poetry. In a famous passage, the wanderer articulates the theme of obeisance